Deep in the wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, an elite U.S. Army team is called to confront an unimaginable threat, something alien, something watching. Captain Ethan Marshall, a seasoned veteran of countless high-stakes missions, receives an urgent and cryptic order from NORAD. The mission seems straightforward: find a missing patrol. But when their journey into the heart of the Rockies uncovers unnatural tracks, vanishing comrades, and otherworldly phenomena, Ethan and his team realize they are up against an intelligence beyond human comprehension. As their perilous journey continues, Ethan joins forces with mysterious allies, including a woman named Isadora who knows more about these extraterrestrial watchers than she lets on. Together, they navigate an increasingly hostile environment filled with ancient temples, glowing symbols, and shadowy beings determined to control or destroy them. Facing unspeakable horrors, they must find and destroy the Watcher's power source, a nexus deep within the forest, before it's too late. Captain Ethan Marshall was no stranger to complex missions. He had years of experience with the U.S. Army, working in covert operations in the Rockies and leading hostage rescue missions. But nothing he had faced before prepared him for the strange summons he received that morning. The message was clear and urgent: immediate report to NORAD command. No further details. Ethan donned his uniform and headed to the base, his gut filled with unease. Upon arrival, he found an unusual atmosphere, tension filled the air, and silence gripped the usually bustling corridors. The soldiers' faces were pale, their eyes reflecting a blend of fear and disbelief. Something terrible was happening. "Captain Marshall, please follow me," said an officer, avoiding eye contact. Ethan was led to an underground conference room. As the doors closed behind him, darkness enveloped the space, broken only by the glow of a projection screen. Seated around the table were several high-ranking officers, and in the center of their attention was a man in a dark suit, clearly out of place in the military setting. The men stood and gestured for Ethan to take a seat. "Captain, my name is Dr. Alan Thompson. I represent an interest beyond the armed forces. What we are dealing with here is," he hesitated for a moment, "extraterrestrial." The word hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Ethan kept his expression stoic, but a chill ran down his spine. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ethan questioned, searching for a hint of sarcasm in the room. But everyone remained dead serious. Dr. Thompson sighed, as if expecting this reaction. "This morning, a reconnaissance patrol disappeared in a remote part of the Rockies, near Pikes Peak. We managed to recover a fragment of communication. Something, or someone, is there, and it doesn't appear to be from this world. We don't know if they are hostile, but the threat level is extremely high." He paused, locking eyes with Ethan. "Your mission is to locate and, if possible, bring back answers." Before Ethan could ask more questions, a recording was played. Static dominated the audio, but something within the distorted noise caught his attention: a scream. It wasn't a human scream, it was guttural, as if it came from a throat that didn't belong to any creature of this earth. The officer next to Ethan pointed to a screen showing the last known location of the patrol. It was a remote, dense area, practically inaccessible by conventional routes. Ethan knew that any attempt to reach it would be extremely dangerous. After the meeting, Ethan left the room with a dossier in hand, containing blurred images and vague descriptions of sightings. Something about luminous spheres, strange light patterns, and, most disturbingly, soldiers reporting that they felt watched by an invisible presence. On the airstrip, a helicopter was already prepared. Ethan met his men, those he had personally chosen for the most difficult missions. Sergeant David Quinn, explosives expert, Lieutenant Sarah O'Connor, an exceptional tracker, and Specialist Alex Grant, a communications expert. They were ready, but the tension on their faces was palpable. "Cap, I heard this mission is different. Something about UFOs." Quinn tried to break the silence with a nervous smile. "We don't believe in alien stories, Quinn. We'll treat this as a rescue mission, nothing more," Ethan replied, trying to keep the team's focus intact. As the helicopter pulled away from the base, the vast expanse of the Rockies spread below, an endless mass of trees and steep cliffs. Low, dark clouds hinted that something more than just a storm was coming. Ethan watched in silence, trying to understand what lay ahead in that wilderness. Hours later, deep in the mountains, the team disembarked at an improvised landing zone. The helicopter took off, leaving them surrounded by dense vegetation and unknown sounds. Grant struggled to stabilize the communication, but the radio only emitted static. "Something's interfering with the signal, Captain," Grant said, frowning. Sarah knelt, examining markings on the ground. "Tracks, but they're not human. They're too large. And it looks like there are more than 4. Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Ethan, clearly disturbed. Ethan examined the tracks. They were deep and wide, as if something heavy had moved through the area. He knelt, touching the soil, feeling an unusual warmth, as if the ground had recently been burned, though there were no signs of fire. "Form a perimeter. We move forward, but stay alert," he ordered, trying to mask his growing unease. Night fell quickly, and the forest turned into a hostile, claustrophobic place. Quinn, usually the one to joke around, was silent, his eyes nervously shifting between the shadows. Something moved between the trees, too fast to identify. Ethan could feel they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, something was out there, and it was intelligent. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the air, making all the soldiers turn at once. Grant dropped to the ground, hands covering his ears. "It's in my head," he screamed, eyes wide with terror. Sarah rushed to help him up, but then something moved past them, a dark blur. Quinn pointed his gun, firing into the void, but the sound seemed absorbed by the darkness, without an echo. "This isn't right," Sarah murmured, panic beginning to take over. Ethan looked around, trying to understand what they were facing. The feeling of being hunted grew, and he knew they couldn't stay there. "Fall back. We need to get out of here now," he ordered. As they ran through the dense forest, Grant's screams echoed, a muffled, desperate sound that suddenly went silent. Ethan stopped and looked back, but all he could see were the dark shadows of the forest, seeming even blacker, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment. The team managed to regroup, but Grant was missing. No one said a word, but they all knew he was likely no longer alive. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility and the certainty that what they were facing wasn't human. They needed answers, and to get them, they would have to venture deeper into the unknown. Ethan looked at his companions, all exhausted and terrified, yet still trusting in him. They needed to be fast, they needed to be careful, and above all, they needed to survive. And deep in his mind, Ethan knew the true mission, understanding what was happening there, had only just begun. It was nearly midnight when Quinn, who was on guard, noticed a flickering light about 50 yards away. It looked like a flashlight, but it oscillated strangely, as if someone were trying to send a signal. "Captain, we've got something." About 50 yards to the north, Quinn whispered, trying to catch Ethan's attention without making too much noise. Ethan moved closer, and the light disappeared for a moment, only to reappear slightly farther away. He frowned, instinct screaming caution. "Should we follow it?" Sarah asked, attempting to keep the nervousness out of her voice. Ethan hesitated for a moment. It was clear this could be a trap, but what if it was Grant? What if he was trying to make his way back? Let's move. Stay close and be ready for anything, he ordered. They advanced slowly, using the vegetation as cover. The light led them to a more open area where the moon illuminated the space. There, at the center of the clearing, stood Grant, or what looked like him. He was standing, his back turned to them, head hung low. "Grant!" Ethan called out, but the soldier didn't move. Sarah took a step forward, and then they all heard it, a whispering sound, coming from all directions. Words that were incomprehensible, like they were being spoken underwater. Quinn began to sweat, his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. "Captain, something's not right," Quinn muttered. Ethan felt it too, something deeply wrong. Grant's body began to convulse in an unnatural way, as though something was controlling his movements. Slowly, he turned his head to face them, and his eyes were completely white, no pupils, no life, as if he had lost all humanity. "Fall back. Now!" Ethan shouted, pulling Sarah backward. Suddenly, the light went out, and the clearing was plunged into darkness. Quinn fired into what he thought was a moving shadow, but there was a grotesque sound, like bones breaking, and Ethan saw Quinn being pulled into the forest, his screams quickly silenced. Ethan and Sarah ran, their hearts pounding, trying to escape the cursed clearing. The forest around them seemed alive, the trees moving, closing off paths. They ran until they could no longer, finally stumbling upon a shallow creek and hiding behind some rocks. Sarah was in shock, her eyes wide, her breathing rapid and erratic. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "We need to keep it together. We can't lose our heads out here, Sarah. We will survive, understand," he said, his voice firm but gentle. She nodded, trying to steady herself, though the terror in her eyes was evident. Ethan knew that at this point, they were alone, no communication, no support, and facing something they couldn't even name. That was when they heard footsteps, light and nearly imperceptible. Ethan raised his weapon, pointing in the direction of the sound, his finger tight on the trigger. "Who's there?" he shouted. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, clearly not military. It was a woman wearing worn clothing and an old hat. Her eyes, however, glowed with a faint green phosphorescence. "You need to leave this place. They already know you're here," she said, her voice low and urgent. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances. Who was this woman? How had she gotten there? "Who are you? What's happening?" Ethan asked, still not lowering his weapon. The woman looked at him, her gaze seeming to penetrate his soul. "There isn't time. I know what you're looking for, but you won't like what you'll find. Come with me if you want to live." Ethan and Sarah followed the woman, who moved through the forest with an almost supernatural agility, as if she knew every tree and stone. They reached a cave camouflaged among roots and dense vegetation. The woman entered, and they hesitated for only a moment before following her. Inside, a small fire illuminated the walls covered in strange symbols and rudimentary drawings of humanoid figures and flying discs. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide. "What is this place?" she whispered. "A safe place." "For now," the woman replied, busy mixing something in strange vials. Ethan approached her, still wary. "You seem to know a lot about what's going on here." "Who are they?" he pressed. The woman sighed, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "They are the ones who came before. We call them watchers. They observe, study, and sometimes they take. This land is not ours alone, Captain. It never has been. Sarah stepped back, the fear evident. Are you saying extraterrestrials? She asked, trying to grasp the logic. The woman nodded. They aren't like we imagined. They don't come in peace, but they aren't exactly at war either. To them, we are experiments, rats in a maze. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew they were dealing with something beyond comprehension, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all the more real and terrifying. Is there any way to fight them? How do we get out of here alive? He asked, his determination rekindled. The woman smiled, a sad, weary smile. There are ways. But to do that, you'll have to face your deepest fears. The forest is alive with their presence, and what we've seen so far is just the surface. There is something far darker at the center, something that should never have been awakened. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sarah. He knew there was no turning back now. They had lost Quinn and Grant, and now they had to push forward, no matter how dark and dangerous the path ahead. Then tell us what we need to do, Ethan said, his voice full of resolve. The woman nodded and took out a hand-drawn map, handing it to Ethan. This is the path. In the heart of the forest, there is an ancient structure. Something the locals have avoided for centuries. If you want to survive, you need to go there and confront them directly. Sarah looked at Ethan, clearly frightened. Captain, what if it's a trap? Ethan looked at the map, then at the woman, who waited silently. He knew they had no choice. Then we walk straight into it. Because staying here means certain death. At dawn, they set out from the cave. The woman, who still refused to give her name, had warned them about the dangers ahead. She handed them small vials containing a thick, blue liquid. This will help avoid detection. It's not a guarantee, but it increases your chances of going unnoticed, she explained, as Ethan examined the vial. What exactly is this? He asked, skeptical. A mixture of herbs and other things you probably don't want to know about. Just trust me, she answered, her voice laden with an authority that left little room for doubt. Sarah glanced at Ethan before gulping down the contents in one go, grimacing at the bitter, metallic taste. Ethan did the same, feeling the heavy liquid slide down his throat. They were in uncharted territory, and any advantage was better than none. The woman led them to the edge of the cave, pointing out a winding, barely marked path disappearing into the dense vegetation. I can't go with you. My role ends here. But remember, the forest will have eyes on all sides. If you see something that seems impossible, don't try to understand it. Just keep moving. Ethan nodded, absorbing her words, and Sarah stepped forward, still pale but determined. Good luck, the woman murmured before disappearing into the vegetation, as if she were part of the forest itself. The two began the trek. The forest around them seemed more hostile than ever. Each leaf, each tree trunk, hid something sinister, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves underfoot. Ethan kept the map in his hands, guiding Sarah along the marked points, while tension grew with each step. After hours of walking, exhaustion began to weigh on them. They stopped for a brief rest by a small stream. Sarah filled a canteen, trying to calm herself. Ethan stood guard, watching the forest around them, senses on high alert. Captain, do you think we'll make it out of here? Sarah asked, her voice low, trying to hide the fear. Ethan looked at her, trying to find the right words. He knew empty promises wouldn't help now. "We'll do our best, Sarah. We'll get to that place and do what we need to do. We have to believe in that," he said, trying to project the confidence he himself sought. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Movement at the edge of the stream. Something moved between the trees, a figure almost translucent, blending in with the surroundings. He raised his hand to signal silence, and Sarah immediately froze, her eyes following Ethan's gaze. The figure was tall, humanoid, but its body didn't reflect light the way a human's would. It was as if it were out of phase with the world around it, a living illusion that shouldn't exist. Ethan felt a chill as he saw that the being had no face, just a smooth, pulsating surface that shifted with the breeze. "Don't move, Sarah," Ethan whispered, trying not to make direct contact. The figure moved closer, its long legs almost floating over the ground. It passed mere feet from where they crouched, pausing as if sniffing the air. The bluish liquid they had ingested seemed to be working, for after a few seconds, the creature moved away, disappearing among the trees. Sarah exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling. "That was one of them," she murmured, eyes wide with fear. Ethan nodded, watching the spot where the creature had vanished. "They're patrolling the area. We need to move quickly. We can't stay here any longer." The path marked on the map led them to increasingly difficult terrain. The tree roots were like traps, and the shadows among them seemed to grow, as if they were closing in. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to form. Ethan knew they were getting close. Finally, they reached a trail that led to a clearing. At its center stood a structure, an ancient stone temple partially consumed by the forest. It was larger than Ethan had imagined, with columns covered in strange inscriptions and symbols resembling constellations and humanoid forms. "This doesn't look man-made, Captain," Sarah said, her voice betraying her fear. Ethan approached the columns, running his hand over the carved symbols. The texture was strangely cold, as if the stone were alive, pulsing under his fingers. He turned to Sarah, resolute. "This is where we'll find answers. Or die trying." This is the continuation of the story, deepening the sense of suspense and adding more encounters with the mysterious beings. The setting and characters have been adjusted to fit the American context. If you're ready, I can keep going chapter by chapter, expanding until the conclusion. Inside the temple, the atmosphere was heavy with an almost physical presence. The light of day barely penetrated, and shadows danced along the walls as if they had a life of their own. At the center, there was an altar covered in strange symbols and markings that indicated a ritualistic purpose. Ethan spotted something floating above the altar, a sphere, made of a translucent material, almost like a bubble of mercury. Sarah moved closer, equal parts fascinated and terrified. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before Ethan could respond, the sphere began to pulsate, emitting a soft blue light that seemed to synchronize with the symbols on the altar. The air around them vibrated, and suddenly both Ethan and Sarah were struck by a searing pain. They dropped to their knees, hands clutching their heads as an ear-splitting sound filled the room, like a scream from another dimension. "Captain!" Sarah cried out, her voice straining against the pain. The shadows on the walls began to move toward them, coalescing and gaining substance. Humanoid figures, similar to the one they had encountered earlier, emerged from the darkness, surrounding them. Their featureless faces seemed to study Ethan and Sarah as the sphere's glow intensified. Ethan knew they were at a breaking point. They had to act before it was too late. Fighting against the overwhelming pain, he reached for the altar, his fingers brushing against the sphere. For a moment, an icy sensation shot through his entire body, like he was submerged in freezing water. Suddenly, everything stopped. The sound vanished, and the figures froze in place. Ethan glanced at Sarah, who was breathing heavily but still conscious. The sphere now seemed inert, as if its energy had been drained. "You did something, Captain," Sarah panted, her voice trembling. Ethan stood, still gasping for breath. "I don't know what I did, but it seems to have stopped them, at least for now. We need to figure out how to use this to our advantage." At that moment, the mysterious woman who had helped them appeared at the entrance of the temple, her eyes still glowing with that eerie green light. "You've managed to pause them. But don't think it's over. They will come back. They always come back. You've only bought some time, a chance to fight." Ethan looked at her, still holding the now lifeless sphere. He knew they were facing something ancient and far beyond human understanding. But as long as there was a chance, he wouldn't give up. "Then tell us how to finish this, once and for all," he said, his determination unwavering. The woman nodded and took out a map, this time showing an even deeper part of the forest. "There is a place further north, a convergence point where their power is strongest. If we can reach it, we might be able to sever their link to our world permanently. But they will be waiting. This won't be easy." Early the next morning, they set out with renewed resolve. The woman introduced herself as Isadora, finally trusting them enough to reveal her name. She guided Ethan and Sarah through the forest, the air growing colder, the shadows deeper with every step. After what seemed like hours, they came across something both incredible and terrifying, a structure hidden deep in the forest, larger and more foreboding than anything they had encountered before. It was a monolithic edifice, half buried beneath years of earth and overgrowth. Strange, almost alien, symbols were etched across its surface, glowing faintly even in the daylight. It was clear they had found the core of the presence that had haunted the region. "Here is where the connection is strongest," Isadora said, her voice hushed in reverence and fear. "This is where they come through. If we destroy this place, we could cripple them." Ethan examined the structure, noting the countless places where explosives could be set to bring it down. Quinn would have been perfect for this, he thought bitterly. But they had no choice but to try with what they had. Sarah unpacked the few explosives they carried. They had to make them count. Every second felt like hours as they worked to place the charges in strategic positions. Ethan felt the weight of his decision, the lives lost and the risk they all now faced. Suddenly, a low hum began, growing in intensity. Isadora's eyes widened. "They know we're here." The temperature dropped drastically as the light dimmed, the sky obscured by unnatural clouds. Figures began to emerge from the forest, dozens of them, all moving with a singular, terrifying purpose, stopping them at any cost. "Cover me," Sarah shouted, setting the final charge. Ethan opened fire, the sound of the gunshots echoing across the clearing, but the bullets seemed to barely slow the advancing figures. Isadora stood at the center of the clearing, her voice rising in a chant, her amulet glowing bright green as she fought to hold the creatures at bay. "Done. Charges set," Sarah yelled. "Everyone fall back," Ethan commanded. They ran, ducking and dodging as the creatures closed in, each one more relentless than the last. The humming grew into a roar, like an endless tide of noise pressing down on them. Ethan pushed Sarah forward as Isadora struggled to keep her voice steady, the glow from her amulet flickering. Once they had reached a safe distance, Ethan turned and detonated the charges. The resulting explosion was deafening, the entire structure crumbling inward, a blinding light flashing out and blurring their vision. When the dust settled, the clearing was quiet. The structure lay in ruins, and the advancing figures had disappeared. Ethan looked around, searching for Isadora. He found her on the ground, exhausted but alive, her amulet shattered in her hand. We did it. Sarah asked, barely believing it herself. Isadora nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. For now. But I can still feel them. We've only severed one connection. They might come again. Ethan offered her a hand, helping her to her feet. He looked at the ruins of the monolith and then back at Sarah and Isadora, his determination undiminished. We'll be ready. No matter how many times they come, we'll fight back. The journey back to the village felt different. They were battered and bruised, and the loss of their friends still weighed heavily, but for the first time, there was hope. As they neared the village limits, they were greeted with cheers and hugs from the villagers. The sight of Ethan, Sarah, and Isadora returning filled everyone with renewed determination. Miguel, the village leader, approached Ethan with tears in his eyes. You came back. We heard the explosions and feared the worst. We lost people, Miguel. But we destroyed their core structure. We bought ourselves some time, but we need to stay prepared, Ethan replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Miguel nodded. We'll do whatever it takes. You've shown us that we can fight, and we will. Over the next few days, the village transformed into a fortress. Everyone pitched in, digging trenches, setting up barriers, and placing traps around the perimeter. Isadora taught them the symbols that would help keep the Watchers at bay, etching them into the wood of their barricades and carving them into the ground. Sarah began training the younger villagers, teaching them how to use bows and improvised weapons. We can't be caught off guard again, she told them, her voice steady and full of resolve. Ethan spent long hours preparing plans for evacuation, defense, and potential counterattacks. They couldn't afford to lose the village. Every life mattered now, and they would defend it to their last breath. A few days after returning, Ethan spotted something strange in the night sky, a light. It moved in unnatural ways, unlike any aircraft he knew. For a moment, it hovered above the treetops, pulsating with a blue glow, before vanishing in the blink of an eye. Sarah approached, having seen the expression on Ethan's face. Is it them? They're watching us, Ethan said, his voice cold. We destroyed their portal, but they're still out there. And they're not going to stop. The villagers continued working tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. The children looked at Ethan and Sarah as heroes, and for a moment, the sense of unity made the village feel like a beacon of light amidst the oppressive darkness of the forest. Isadora, however, wasn't at ease. One night, she approached Ethan and Sarah, her face pale. They're coming. I can feel it. They won't let us be, not after what we've done. Then we fight, Ethan responded without hesitation. We have something we didn't before, hope. And that makes us dangerous to them. The calm before the storm was almost unbearable. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the Watchers returned. And when the bells began to ring one night, the warning spread like wildfire. Ethan rushed to the front lines, seeing the figures emerging from the tree line, more of them than he had ever imagined. The Watchers moved in unison, like a dark, relentless wave. Positions. Everyone, hold your positions. Ethan shouted. The villagers, armed with everything they had, gathered in a circle around the village center, where Isadora stood, amulet in hand, her voice rising in a chant. The symbols etched into the barricades began to glow faintly, creating a shimmering barrier that held back the advancing creatures, but only barely. "They're too strong," Sarah yelled over the noise. "We can't hold them forever." Ethan knew she was right. "Everyone, fall back to the center. Protect Isadora." The villagers formed a defensive line around Isadora, who continued her chant. The watchers pressed against the barriers, their faceless forms straining against the glowing symbols. Just when it seemed the light would fail, Isadora's amulet shone with a blinding light, exploding outward and forcing the creatures back. When the light faded, the watchers were gone. The villagers stood in stunned silence, barely able to believe they were still alive. Isadora dropped to her knees, the amulet broken in her hand. "They're gone. For now. But this isn't over." The days following the battle brought a strange, uneasy calm. The villagers remained on constant alert, wary of the Watcher's return. One morning, as Ethan patrolled the village's edge, he saw something unexpected: a lone man, stumbling through the forest. The man's clothes were tattered, his face worn and haunted. He raised his hands in surrender as Ethan approached. "My name is Andrew. I know about the Watchers. I know how to stop them," he said, his voice weak but determined. Ethan studied the man's face, seeing the desperation and something else: hope. He called for Sarah and Isadora, who quickly joined him. Andrew explained that he had been part of a government research expedition. They had been sent to investigate strange occurrences in the area but were attacked by the Watchers. He was the only one who escaped. "They have a central control point, a nexus where all their power converges. I escaped with this," he said, showing them a small metallic device, glowing faintly blue. "This device can disrupt their connection, but we need to get close enough to use it." Ethan looked at Sarah and Isadora, and both nodded. This might be the chance they had been waiting for. Before dawn the next day, Ethan, Sarah, Isadora, Andrew, and a young villager named Raphael set out. Andrew led them to the point marked on his map. The forest seemed more oppressive than ever, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. After hours of trekking, they reached a clearing dominated by massive pillars of metal, pulsating with an eerie blue light. At its center stood a floating structure, humming with energy. "This is it," Andrew whispered. "We need to plant the explosives here, and I need to use the device on that central tower." The group moved with purpose. Ethan signaled for Sarah and Raphael to cover the perimeter while Andrew and Isadora worked to disable the shield protecting the core. The creatures noticed their presence almost immediately. Ethan opened fire, trying to buy them time as the Watchers advanced. "Protect the tower," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Sarah fought alongside him, her shots slowing the creatures but failing to stop them completely. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, Andrew activated the device, and the shield around the core flickered and fell. "Now, plant the charges," Ethan yelled. Raphael and Isadora rushed to position the explosives while Andrew worked on the device. The creatures pushed closer, and one of them grabbed Andrew by the arm. His eyes met Ethan's, a look that conveyed a silent understanding. "Go, Ethan. Finish this," Andrew shouted as the creature dragged him away. Ethan hesitated for just a moment before signaling the others to retreat. Isadora whispered her incantations, and the glowing symbol slowed the creatures just enough for them to escape the blast radius. Ethan hit the detonator, and the explosion was deafening. The core was engulfed in flames, and the entire structure collapsed in on itself. The Watchers disintegrated in the blinding light, like shadows evaporating under the sun. When the dust settled, Ethan, Sarah, Isadora, and Raphael stood amid the silence. The forest seemed almost peaceful again. The trek back to the village was long and quiet. The group was battered, but there was a sense of accomplishment. They had struck a blow against the Watchers, perhaps even ended the threat, at least for now. The villagers welcomed them back with cheers, hope shining in their eyes. Miguel approached, eyes wet with tears. "You did it. I can't believe you did it," he said, embracing Ethan. "We lost good people, but we stopped them." "At least for now," Ethan replied, his voice filled with both grief and hope. Over the next days, the village continued to strengthen its defenses, but this time there was less fear and more determination. They had faced the unimaginable, and they had won. As Ethan looked at Sarah, Isadora, and the villagers, he felt a profound sense of purpose. They had fought for their survival and proved that humanity was not helpless against the darkness. Isadora, her amulet now just a broken piece of stone, looked at the rising sun with a smile. "The resistance is in each of us. As long as there are those willing to fight, the darkness will never have control." And so, as the sun rose over the village, casting its golden light over the forest, Ethan knew that this was not just a victory, it was a new beginning. Together, they had faced the impossible, and together, they had prevailed. The resistance would continue, ready to face whatever came next.